Hello, I'm Dr. Stephen Hassan with another episode of the Influence Continuum. And my guest today is Jonathon Sawyer, a PhD candidate at the University of Colorado Boulder. And I want to say, Jonathon, you have a fascinating background and story. And my good friend Frederick Clarkson called my attention to a published journal article that you wrote. And I said to Fred, I'm so busy, I can't get to it for a while. And then I looked at it and skimmed it, and I was like, I want to interview Jonathon Sawyer sooner than later.
Thank you.
And I want to get into more of your qualifications for this, but I thought that for my listeners, I would just read the abstract from your journal article, which summarizes things. It was your piece was published in the Review of Education, Pedagogy, and Cultural Studies, and that's a Rutledge Press, which I just did a textbook on clinical hypnosis for Rutledge, very respected academic publishing house. The title of your article is called "Unhidden from Self on LGBTQ Students and the Conspiratorial Demonology of the New Apostolic Reformation." And my listeners have heard me talking about NAR, New Apostolic Reformation, for many years. I wrote about it in The Cult of Trump. I've interviewed Andre Gagne, who is a former pastor of one of these groups, Frederick Clarkson, who helped me extensively. But it's a force, a political force in politics, not just in the United States, but internationally. And so and this interface and your own personal experience is so unique and interesting. I wanted to do this episode with you. But first, let me just, if you don't mind, I'm going to read a very short abstract for your journal article. And you said, in this conceptual essay, the author draws upon scholarship to reflect on personal experiences in a school associated with the New Apostolic Reformation, a neo-charismatic Pentecostal network within the broader Christian nationalist movement. The author discusses the educational implications of the NAR's conspiratorial teachings about how demonic activity is believed to cause inner LGBTQ experiences. The author shows how conspiratorial demonology is present in the curriculum, pedagogy, and policies of P to 16 schools influenced by the New Apostolic Reformation. The author thus argues the need for constitutional protections and curriculum regulation for LGBTQ students in New Apostolic Reformation and other religious schools. Throughout the essay, the author specifically reflects on students in religious schools who may have inner LGBTQ experiences but do not conceive of themselves as LGBTQ. And I want to disclose, not for the first time, my son is gay. I'm a therapist and LGBTQ friendly, and I believe people are born gay, and it is not something that they are made gay by anything their mother or fathers do in their education. And I will say, as a therapist, I've helped countless people who were gay in one of these homophobic churches or networks or organizations who, were just demonized. And in many cases, they tried to exorcise demons out of these young people, and how horrific it is. And just before we started recording, I said, Jonathon, you're the first person I believe I've ever actually had on the Influence Continuum who has had a firsthand experience about that. And I want to come back to some of your academic achievements, but can we just start there? What the heck foul-smelling demons that some of these so-called prophets and apostles claim they can discern and they're going to fix it? I mean, please, talk to us.
Yeah, so I was raised in the neo-charismatic Pentecostal movement in part, and from a very young age had been exposed to teachings, to books, to cassette tapes. I'm old enough to remember those.
Me too.
Where people in the neo-charismatic Pentecostal movements, which came out of the latter rain, which was a revivalist movement in the mid-20th century, began to write a lot about demons. And there was a lot of writing and teachings about what was referenced as homosexual demons. And I remember that type of rhetoric from as early as 8 or 9 years old.
Mm-hmm.
As I progressed into my adolescence, I began to grapple with my own inner experiences of attraction to the same sex, as I would have called it at the time. I desperately wanted that fixed. And I had been introduced at around 8 or 9 to a gentleman named Robert Slerdon,
Mm-hmm.
who was an early quote unquote apostle of C. Peter Wagner's New Apostolic Reformation networks.
Mm-hmm.
And C. Peter Wagner was a professor at Fuller Theological Seminary who began to network with many megachurches of the neo-Pentecostal charismatic variety.
Right.
And he began to point to these as churches that were participating in a third apostolic age prior to the second coming of Jesus Christ. And this Lerdon gentleman, who I had heard write about homosexual demons in a book he wrote called Haunted Houses, Ghosts, and Demons, was a rising star in both the Word of Faith movement, which is oriented to the prosperity gospel. So give your money to God, you'll get a bunch back. And he was also as I mentioned earlier, an early apostle appointed through the NAR networks.
Mm-hmm.
As I moved into my late adolescence, I finished high school. I had a scholarship to study music education at a public university, and I gave that up. And I went to Lerdon's Bible School, which was known as Spirit Life Bible College in Orange County, California. And the first week of school, they had a session called Clean Out Week. And Clean Out Week was where all of the students would come together and be in these mystical, trance-like experiences where you're speaking in tongues, where you're engaging in spiritual warfare, where you're engaging in fighting the devil, where you
I gotta do air quotes on that, buddy, for those who are not watching the video, but it's talked about in such certain terms, and it's just made up stuff. Please continue.
Yeah, and even as I talk about it now, I can even feel my body remembering what it felt like to be in that very militaristic, authoritarian environment. And we are surrounded by music that is playing, loud drums that are banging, people screaming in tongues with ecstatic utterances on the stage. And we had been primed to hear stories about people who had been delivered from demons.
Delivered in air quotes.
Correct. Yeah, we'll just assume air quotes moving forward. And I think the point I want to really emphasize is I really believed this stuff. This was something that I really firmly believed was happening. I thought that there were spiritual manifestations happening in the room, and I believed that this gentleman Lerdon had the power to deliver me from evil through, of course, Jesus Christ. But essentially, it was the power of the prophet that many of us were most interested in.
So if I may, Jonathan, interrupt you for 1 second, because we're just talking to each other for the first time.
Yeah.
I was raised Jewish, so I didn't believe in demons and Satan. Was recruited into the Moonies, was taken to see the Exorcist movie. And then Moon gave a lecture how God made the Exorcist, and this is a prophecy of what would happen to us if we left. So I was afraid of demonic possessions, and I believed that these evil spirits were surrounding, and I needed to purify myself. So I just want you to know I have a firsthand experience from a different cult of the power of such fear such absolute fear and terror that you're being, attacked by these entities, and that
Mm,
you need help to be purified. So I'm with
yeah.
you.
And I've heard that story, and it's made me feel seen. And so I thank you for sharing that,
Sure.
and with all of your important work. During this clean out week session, without going into all of the details, because it really was a traumatic experience that has taken many years of personal work to get to the point to be able to share. The early apostle, quote unquote, of the New Apostolic Reformation leaped off the stage, hit me in the head. I fell over. He sat on my chest and he proceeded to attempt to cast demons out of me that I believed at the time to be demons of homosexuality. And for a moment, I lost my breath and had a moment of disassociation. And that led to some significant emotional turmoil, of course, over the next few years as both a psychological and physical assault. But there was a part of that where, because I sincerely believed I played the role,
Mm-hmm.
and I think that is often what happens. But I also had a moment of clarity during that disassociation where I went, what on earth is happening?
Mm.
And
If I remember in your article, you talked about how you had bad body odor. You
yes,
remember?
yes, yeah, yeah. I remember the
Sorry for
hairy chest and the body
laughing, but
odor.
it's just
Yeah,
like
yeah, yeah.
foul smelling demons, and the guy's
Right.
foul smelling himself. I couldn't resist thinking about
I've heard
that.
others make that statement when I've shared the story. But he wrote about this, and I'll cut to the very end of this story. The school and church that I was associated with eventually imploded, and it was a mega church. It was on the rise. It was featured in C. Peter Wagner's first book
Mm,
on the New Apostolic Reformation,
mm,
called The New Apostolic Churches.
mm-hmm.
And Lairdon was in a homosexual relationship, as featured in Charisma News, or as exposed in Charisma News, and it was also in the LA Times. And it was a very unsettling thing for all of us who were involved, because we were so intimately connected to the hostile rhetoric about gays and lesbians. Um, and I don't know for sure, but I suspect that Mr. Lairdon himself, in his own upbringing, had been subjected to traumatic experiences that are then playing out on others, which is why I'm speaking out, because more people need to know that those who sometimes are discriminated against become those who discriminate.
Yeah, it's the victim-victimizer model that I've
Yeah.
encountered over and over again. And people are on automatic pilot, and they exteriorize or project their own inner demons, like psychological conflictual stuff, not
Mm-hmm.
supernatural entities, but they project it onto others, and they're going to fix everyone else. But they have
Yeah.
no self-reflection or methodology for understanding
Mm-hmm.
what's normal and what's healthy. And
Yeah.
so many of these people were raised in corporal punishment environments where they were, trained through force and violence to obey and not
Yeah.
think for themselves or use their own conscience.
And that was the environment that we as students were subjected to at this school. And Lairdon himself has acknowledged that he grew up in a difficult circumstance, as far as some of what you've alluded to with corporal punishment, and yet even to this day continues to promote um, these ideas regarding an alleged trip to heaven when he was 8 years old, where he had a water fight with Jesus in the river of life, and where he saw a mansion with body parts, and that those people on the earthly realm could claim those body parts, in these divine healing services. And even to this day, tragically, preaches quite hostilely about the LGBTQ community, with a specific focus on transgender populations.
So, Jonathan, if I may, just we do a conversational thing
Yeah.
on the influence continuum. I just came from a meeting with a family, and I do prep meetings with families who are concerned about a loved one who's gotten into a destructive cult. So I was
Yeah.
teaching about hypnosis, which is an area that I've studied extensively since the early 1980s. And I was asking them, the family, have you ever seen a stage hypnosis demonstration? Oh, yes, I did at high school. I said, tell me what you remember. Well, two people were on stage, and one was told they were a Martian and could only speak Martian. And the other
Mm.
one was told that they understand Martian and can interpret it.
Mm.
And they described the scene, with welcome, Earthlings,
Yeah,
greetings from Mars. And I said, that's a little like glossolalia in these
it
groups
is.
that are speaking in tongues where people are interpreting. And all of the experts who've studied language, who understand dissociative states, etc., say there's no ancient tongues here. This is phoneme combinations. And in
Hmm.
fact,
Hmm.
early in my career, I was helping people get out of a cult called The Way International,
Hmm.
where they actually had classes to teach people how to speak in tongues. And so, as a young ex-Moonie who was like getting my chops in, learning about other cults, I figured I can do this,
Yeah,
and whatever.
yeah,
And
yeah,
I'm not making fun of people who think that they're having a spiritual experience. And I never tell people you're not having a spiritual
sure.
experience. But my whole thing is to offer alternative explanations for people to
Hmm.
consider phenomenon that is extraordinary, that's not in the range of most normal people's experiences. Because
Hmm.
how could someone be called up by a stage hypnotist and speak Martian and someone else interpret
Yeah.
if it wasn't a hypnotic experience?
Yeah, Steve, John 20 years ago would have taken offense at what you just said because I was so believing that my speaking in tongues was a heavenly language. I so believed that it was a way to fight off demons and demonic influences. And it's taken a lot of work for me to now essentially agree. And one of the concerns that I have, especially as it pertains to my academic work, is that we're seeing more and more taxpayer supportive religious schools in the United States, particularly at the K through 12 level.
Yeah.
And arguably, and perhaps not even arguably, adolescents and young people and children are especially susceptible to some of the most, what I would say, are harmful aspects of radical religion, thought stopping religion, the type of things that you importantly study. And the public needs to know that religion can be wielded in very positive, wonderful, altruistic ways. And it can also be wielded in very harmful ways.
Yep.
And there's
Exactly.
a,
That's why I have my influence continuum and talk about
yeah,
healthy influence, healthy religions give informed consent,
yeah,
validate people's authentic sense of self, conscience, critical thinking, free will to look at other forms of information, and freedom to leave if a particular environment is not serving somebody, versus the lack of informed consent, the lying, the withholding information,
mhm,
the doctrine as if it's true with a capital T, the certainty, the fear, the guilt, the dependency, that pseudo self that is described as a dissociative disorder in the American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic Statistical Manual. I
mhm,
mean, I really had a Mooney self for two and a
yeah,
half years who thought the real Steve was evil and satanic, and my parents were just my physical parents who were satanic, but Moon and his wife were my true parents and they were
mm,
sinless. So I
right,
really had this experience of a split where I wasn't
mhm,
allowed to think for myself. And if I did, I immediately was trained to do thought stopping, or I had these phobias that had been programmed into my mind to be afraid of the exorcist demonic
yeah,
possession scenario.
yeah. Yeah, and as I was finishing up high school and considering what was next, really I had a period of radicalization that started much earlier than that, but it was toward the end of high school that I was influenced by what was called the Toronto Blessing, which was a movement where individuals were engaging in things like shooting Holy Ghost fireballs at others, and then people would fall over. And, there were things like people manifesting animal sounds and these kind of things that were all, as I look at it now, form perhaps of mass hypnosis. And yet I was so hypnotized. And I, at the to the chagrin of some of the more rational people in my orbit at that time, they didn't know what was happening. They couldn't believe that I was giving up a scholarship to go study music education and going to this school.
Right.
And the way that people responded to me in those situations was often with anger, and sometimes with comments like, have fun going to this subpar, place that you're going. So sort of belittling
Sure.
what I was experiencing at that time. And that actually perpetuated me further.
Yep. That's what I teach.
Yeah.
I wrote Freedom of Mind, how to help loved ones. I'm like, well, the last thing you do is say negative things about the leader, the doctrine, or the policy, because it will make the cult identity go deeper, feel persecuted, isolate them further, versus having a respectful, curious, asking questions. Help me understand how you make sense of this being a better thing for God to want you to do. And God gave you these musical creative gifts, John.
Yeah. Well, and I heard, and please correct me if I'm wrong, Steve, but I heard that your parents at one point took you to your rabbi.
My
Is that
mom,
correct?
yeah, when my
Okay.
first 3-day Mooney workshop, she said, "You look high. Are you on drugs this weekend?" I'm like, "I don't think they gave me drugs." "Where were
Yeah.
you?" "I don't know, upstate New York at this, retreat/workshop." And she's like, "Let's go talk to the rabbi." And the rabbi was clueless and should have said, "I have no idea what you just experienced, but let me reassure you, if it's legitimate, it will be there next week. Take a
Yeah.
time out. Don't talk to these people. Let's do some independent research to try and
Mm.
find out who they are." And
Mm.
back,
And was this before you were fully
oh
immersed
yeah,
in
this
the
was
Moonies?
literally the first weekend, and he could have really intervened, but he didn't understand the phenomenon. And my main
Mm.
question that had been pounded into my head is, are these the last days? And do
Mm.
Jews believe in a Moshiach, in a Messiah that's going to come and save the world? Because the
Yeah.
Moonies knew I was Jewish, so they were pitching the Moshiach as opposed to, the new Jesus. But the rabbi thought I wanted to become a Christian, which I didn't. But he didn't ask me questions. He just said,
Yeah.
"I'm happy to study with you if you want to know more about Torah." And it was like not a match at all.
Well, you point to the necessity of religious leaders being aware of your work, Steve. I had a somewhat parallel experience during that time of radicalization, where my mother and stepfather, who were the ones who were not thrilled with the direction I was taking. The influence of demons and the word of faith and all of that came through another set of parents. But my mother and stepfather also took me to a Christian minister of a more uh, of a more mainline denominational church. And it was similar. It was less about asking questions and understanding the psychological mechanisms as it was about finding a way to be integrated into their more moderate Christian community. I didn't do that, obviously, at that time.
Right. So, I mean, my approach is empowering people to think for themselves. And
Mm,
so it's not trying to persuade people. It's not trying to control people. or tell them what to think, feel, or act. But hey, I'm interested. You're a smart person. What is this that attracts you? What makes you think this is the path for you? Have you investigated other options towards that spiritual interest that you have?
mm, mm,
And just a respectful, curious approach is what really works. And also not talking against the group directly, but talking about other groups that the person would agree are cults or bad groups, whether it's Chinese communist brainwashing programs or pimps and traffickers, which is the two case examples I find most useful with MAGA folks. They will listen if it's presented in a respectful way. They'll be curious. How do pimps recruit and indoctrinate people to become slaves?
mm,
Or
mm,
what does the Chinese government do to make Muslims Han Chinese? Or
mm.
to turn in
Yeah,
their mother and father or sister and brother or their husband or wife because they believe it's a good thing.
yeah. And the parallels between these forms of thought-stopping religions and politics are so important. And I know you've written about that recently. But it is quite alarming to me as I survey the landscape of the United States to see um, that there are people in the political arena that are employing the type of language about demons, for example, that I heard at Bible school
Yeah.
back in my late adolescence. And there's a bringing to public consciousness some of these really harmful ideas that many people believe. And I think that has implications for individual well-being, mental and emotional health, and democratic implications that we can't forget about.
Yeah, absolutely. So I can't help but name Betsy DeVos, who was Donald
Mm-hmm.
Trump's Secretary of Education, who played a big role to fund these charter schools, to defund public education, which emphasizes science and history and women's rights and gay rights and other values that are consistent with the American experience, and push this kind of homeschooling curriculum or religious indoctrination curriculum. Um, but let's circle back to ex-evangelicals and people like yourself who, when basically realize this is not healthy. I don't want to
Mm-hmm.
be here. This is not good for me. Let's. Can you share some more about your journey?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for naming the what's happening in education right now, because it is so important to think about the groups that are funding the push to privatize education, to the push to possibly um, use taxpayer dollars to support the type of discrimination that I described in the Exorcism.
Yeah,
But
I
as a
want to name Catherine Stewart's work too, the power
yes,
worshiper. She's been
yes,
researching that whole religious right children education thing in a number of good books. Forgive me for
yes,
interrupting you again.
yes, and Ann Nelson wrote a book
And
on the Council for National Policy.
which the
Other
Moonies
scholars like
were founding members of, and they put the editor of the Washington Times in place, which is my former cult's newspaper, which I learned a few months ago has been at the Center for Client Science Denial for 50
wow,
years.
wow, that blows my mind to learn that. A lot of good work out there right now from scholars on the New Apostolic Reformation, such as Matthew Taylor,
Interviewed
and
him. Yeah, he's
excellent, yeah, excellent interview, and
Ben
Fred
Onishi,
Clarkson,
Frederick
yeah,
Clarkson, Andre Gagne wrote a great book.
yeah, yeah. So for those who are listening to this for the first time and thinking about what is this NAR, go to some of those folks. They really know what they're discussing. And as it pertains to my own journey out of this radical form of neo-charismatic Pentecostalism. It's been really interesting, Steve, because I heard about your work years ago, and I recall some parts of evangelicalism at that time thinking about other cults. And so at the time, evangelicals would look at Mormonism, or they'd point their fingers at Christian Science or other groups. There was a guy named Walter Martin who wrote a book called Kingdom
I
of the
knew
Cults.
him personally,
Oh, wow.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And the Southern Baptists plugged my first book, Combating Cult Mind Control, when it first came out in 1988.
Oh, yeah. And I think around those times, even though I was being indoctrinated into my own form of thought-stopping religion that scholars or others might categorize as evangelical, there was this also this awareness of the type of ways that religion could be used to control behaviors and information and emotions, and using your
Thoughts,
bite
yeah.
model, thoughts, right? And and yet there was less of a willingness, at least at that time, for some of these evangelical communities to look at their own communities.
Yes.
And for example, the school that I went to at Spirit Life Bible College, I dug up the old application that I filled out, and they asked me questions about homosexuality. They asked me questions about whether I had ever been involved in groups like Christian Science, Mormonism, Transcendental Meditation, and others. And yet,
and you were, I believe, because I looked at your website, John Sawyer, and I saw that you were on my friend and colleague Rachel Bernstein's Indoctrination podcast talking about those early childhood
there were
exposures.
some influences in my family with a variety of groups, such as Christian Science and TM. But I would say this neo-charismatic Pentecostal group and the Word of Faith, eventually becoming the New Apostolic Reformation, was what really had manipulated my mind to a strong degree.
Yeah.
And I was not able to see that some of the unhealthy dynamics of other groups were applying to what I was experiencing at that school. And I'd be curious what lessons, Steve, you think we can take from that?
Well, there have been a number of different orientations to the study of cults, and Walter Martin used a very fundamentalist interpretation of scripture as his criteria. So he evaluated the Mormons, the Jehovah's Witnesses, Seventh-day Adventists, etc., not a focus on social psychology and hypnosis and influence techniques, which is, my body of work comes out of the fact I was in the Moonies and I had this deprogramming where Chinese communist, the 8 criteria of Robert J. Lifton and Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism was used. And I was programmed in the Moonies. We were God, they were Satan. Chinese communism was atheist and Satan. But the Moonies were doing the same 8 criteria. It wasn't enough to get me out at that moment, but man, did it create a lot of confusion and dissonance between my authentic self that could think and my cult self that was trained to obey no matter what. But when I'm really on a heavy emphasis on in my life now is wanting to update the law, wanting to teach everyone the influence continuum, the bite model, malignant narcissism, which is the stereotypical profile of all cult leaders and predators, and psychoeducation, because my perception is that there's psychological warfare happening through the internet, through social media and the media, and through politics to destroy America and any democracy. And it's the authoritarians that just don't want to lose power, and they want to keep pumping fossil fuels even though it's killing our habitat for all, including themselves and their children and great grandchildren. So I just see the only solution is for amplifying folks like yourself and myself to get the word out. There's life after cult. Here's here's these all these different experiences that people have in these different groups, and to warn people don't get involved, and to reach out to people who are currently involved, and also to make it okay to leave, to just be a role model of, hey, I left the Moonies and life's been good, like really good for me. I have 2 masters, a PhD, I travel the world, I live in a nice home, and I scuba dive, and I love to read books and teach, and I've had a great life since I left the cult. When I was in the cult, John, I didn't read any books other than the Moonies stuff. It was just propaganda, propaganda, propaganda. My brain shrunk also from lack of sleep, because I was sleeping 3 to 4 hours a night, because these were the last days. I actually thought 1977, World War III was going to happen in 1977.
Yeah. Yeah, I grew up with a lot of that, indoctrination of fear and the imminence of the end of the world, and that still exists in these new Apostolic Reformation circles. In perhaps they're taking a different spin with these ideas of the preaching that Christians should dominate these 7 cultural spheres of influence, which they name as government, business, the arts, media, family, religion, and education. And so they're taking this.
And the government and military. You're talking about the 7 Mountains Mandate.
Right. They're taking this very conquest oriented way of disseminating their religion. And it's the type of environment that I was exposed to at the Bible school we're talking about.
Yep.
And I don't think that is good in the long run for sincere believers of any religious persuasion. Because the more that government is entangled with religion and promotes a dominant form of religion, the more sincere believers are eventually harmed by that.
Yeah.
And to move it back to the personal, it is not good for the individual's psyche, for their emotional well-being. You asked me earlier about my exodus from these movements, and I'm 43 years old. I didn't earn my bachelor's degree until I was 38. I didn't earn my master's degree until I was 40. And the reason for that is because I had almost 2 decades of needing to work through some of what I experienced at this school.
Right.
And I'm one example of that. And there are others out there and others listening to this podcast who have perhaps been through some similar things. And it's important to think about the psychological traumas. It's important to think about how that the law and policy can help to minimize that and to move us as a society into a direction that is more safe for all of the citizens. And I fear that's not the direction we're headed with far-right politics right now.
Yeah, exactly. Especially. And they're spinning a falsehood about the founders.
Mm-hmm.
The founders of America wanted to separate church and state. They wanted to get away from the Church of England and the king, because they wanted to make it safe for people to have different beliefs and live together. And I think part of America's strength is that we are an immigrant, society with people from so many different backgrounds, getting to know each other, learn from each other, contribute to each other, and such. And so this is just a lie, a big lie. But I want to come back to me for a second, Jonathan.
Yeah.
I was in the room with Sun Myung Moon in 1974 when he said, democracy is satanic. God wants a theocracy. We have to infiltrate the government. When we take over, we'll amend the Constitution and make it a capital offense for people to not to have sex outside of their unification church, arranged marriages. And I was like,
mm,
yes, Father. This was 1974 and five.
wow.
So for me, this has been a 50-year saga of seeing this craziness become more mainstream.
Right. And there's lots of activism right now in communities around education and school boards. There was a quote unquote apostle of the New Apostolic Reformation named Clay Nash who organized these prayer calls for Donald Trump's election. And I recently heard him at a church as I was viewing a video where he questioned democracy and questioned the ability for democracy to sustain itself, and seemed to be implying to the audience that democracy is something that we shouldn't strive for. And that concerns me when people in congregations are hearing this. It concerns me when you have religious schools that are going to be teaching these things, because we didn't get to where we are today without people being children
Right.
and learning through their family structures, through their churches, through their schools, these authoritarian dynamics that have led us to this point.
Yeah, no, exactly. The children are our future.
Mm,
And what I'd like to say now is just when I'm teaching my influence continuum on the ethical side, I talk about authoritative parenting,
mm,
where parents start with the assumption that your child is a unique spirit or a unique being, and your job as a parent is to help steward their growth to become their own person.
mm,
And so healthy parenting is developmentally appropriate, but always thinking what's going to help my child grow up to be true to themselves
mm, mm,
versus the authoritarian side where you want a clone of yourself. You want them to believe what your religious beliefs are, and you're prepared to, beat the crap out of them if they disobey you, that you tell them what they can read and what they can't read, etc. And it stultifies a healthy brain development that we
mm.
now know 25, 26 is when our executive, functioning skills mature fully, not 18. And
Right,
what we're
right.
seeing with social media, and Jonathan Haidt has a new book based on a lot of research on the detrimental effects of social media. And it's causing people to be on, the social media is programmed to make people addicted, and it's causing depression, anxiety, suicidality, eating disorders, body dysmorphia, and a whole bunch of other, conspiracy,
Yeah.
indoctrination into QAnon. And again, I come back to my frame is like we have to educate everybody about
Mm,
how the mind works, how to tell the difference between good influences and bad influences. There is no such thing as alternative facts. They're called
mm,
lies.
mm, mm.
Science matters. Science not perfect, but the thing that's great about science is it's a community-based effort where people are challenging ideas. They're not truths with a capital T, they're hypotheses, and
Yeah,
where we can
yeah.
progress by tests and challenges to existing protocols.
Yeah, given my own upbringing and my influence in these neo-charismatic NAR groups, I was indoctrinated to fear learning anything that was outside of what the group was putting forward. I was indoctrinated with this idea that public schools were bastions of liberalism where people don't actually think and learn anything. I was indoctrinated to be suspicious of higher education. And so as I even went through my own journey academically, scholastically, I had to work through a lot of that, because I found that actually the reverse is true. the more that I am engaging in education and engaging with ideas that might be a bit uncomfortable, that I might disagree with, but I'm actually learning from others who hold different values and different persuasions, who've had different experiences from me. That has been so invaluable. And I wouldn't have gotten that if I had remained in the confines of what I like to think of as a authoritarian religious regime.
Yeah.
And as I think about the way that our country, in certain aspects of it anyway, are moving, I don't want to go back there. I don't want to go back to the Bible college that I attended. That was, even though I was a true believer, it was also a very painful and miserable experience. And I don't want that for students, and I don't want that for society, which is why I think the work you're doing, Steve, is so important, and that I hope I'll be able to contribute to in my own scholarship.
Oh, you absolutely are contributing to it. And I just, I guess I want to name, this whole school of conversion therapy, quote unquote. I did a whole blog against it. I know Exodus closed down. They said we were wrong. The Moonies had their own version of this, trying to, indoctrinate gay people into believing they were straight and marrying them to men or to women. It doesn't work. It's not true to a person's soul. And therefore, talk a little bit more about the fact that there are still these conversion efforts out there, thinking that you can brainwash people not to be gay anymore.
Yeah, it's quote unquote therapy, conversion, right. Quote unquote therapy.
Torture.
Conversion therapy. Torture, yeah. It can take many forms, and throughout history, it's gone from extremes of, electroshock treatments to more of a subtle influence on the mind, such as what I experienced throughout my childhood regarding associating gay or lesbian experiences or subjectivities with demonic influence. I would call that a form of conversion therapy, even though it's not in a quote-unquote therapist's office.
Right.
But when I was at this school that
where they send people.
Right. And I, after my sessions of exorcism, and I had several of them while I was at that school, I was also sent to a bona fide conversion therapist who later lost his license due to inappropriate relationships with his clients. But that whole milieu existed in the late 90s and sadly still exists today. You hear the rhetoric, particularly about the LGBTQ community today on the far right. And I'm grateful not to be in New Apostolic Reformation churches or schools anymore. But I can't help but have a deep suspicion that the type of things that I was subjected to are still happening often behind these closed doors. There have been some legal efforts to, draw conversion therapy to a close. But because we have what I believe is a great right of constitutional freedom of religion, it does complicate things because there is religiously motivated discrimination that happens. And I think we need to think more deeply about how to grapple with that in law and policy. Because religion that harms others, religion that demonizes others, religion that serves to weaponize toward a particular community, that serves to actually cause physiological responses to trauma and psychological responses to trauma, those things, the justices, the people who think about the law, I think would be doing a great disservice to protect the citizenship of the United States not to think about that.
Absolutely. Are you familiar with Marcy Hamilton's work, the law professor from Penn? She is the CEO of ChildUSA.org. I have a podcast interview with Marcy, and she and I go back many decades, where she wrote God versus the Gavel.
Mm,
And it's her legal mind talking about this very point, about religious freedom versus human rights.
mm, mm,
And I believe that basically religious groups have been lobbying politicians and funding them to just give a what's called a ministerial exemption.
right.
If the IRS says you're a religion, as they said with Scientology, that wasn't a religion for 25 years until they sued the IRS, harassed IRS commissioners, lied and defrauded in their application, and then got religious status. Now, all of a sudden, they have rights and privileges that allow them to traffic their members, children. I just have a podcast out about a young man who was trafficked. He was made to sign a billion-year contract. He wanted to leave at
Oh,
15, and they wouldn't let him, and they punished him. And so if I had my way, John Sawyer, I would say let's use the influence continuum and let's make sure any group that has religious status gives fully informed consent, which
yeah,
means telling people upfront who you are, what you believe, and what's going to happen if you join. And it's not a one-time document. It's an ongoing process of informed consent. So if a person says, I want to see the accounting records of my nonprofit church, I want to know how much money the pastor's taking for his luxury vacations or to buy his third corporate jet. There
right.
shouldn't be different. I mean,
Yeah,
if you're applying the law to used car salesmen and saying it's illegal to change the odometer reading,
yeah,
why is it okay if someone says, well, I am a prophet of God and therefore I can lie? I mean, as a Mooney, we were told it's heavenly deception if we're telling
yeah.
lies for God.
You know, church-run schools don't have to report. They have very lots of protections regarding the finances that are taken into these institutions. And that gets me worked up, as you can probably see with my body language, because when I was at this school that I've been discussing, the New Apostolic Reformation, quote unquote, apostle invited all of us to tour around his new jet airplane. And when religion is being manipulated not only to harm individuals, but also to advance one person's pleasure through things like jet airplanes and all of these earthly
Limousines,
goods.
mansions.
Right, right. It is. It's something that is sadly still very prominent in the United States. Religions. There's huge amount of money that is attached to religious organizations, and the public, I think, are thinking about it more and more. And work like yours, Steve, helps amplify it. And so I'm grateful for that work because um, it's going to take all of us. It's going to take both liberals and thoughtful conservatives, and I would say thoughtful liberals, to come together and to think about ways that we can structure our society that minimizes some of the harms that we've been discussing.
Yeah, it's going to take all of us, and it's going to require protecting ourselves from feeling personally attacked when people call me demons all the time, John. You have to understand. I'm
I've had it too.
I'm
Yeah, yeah,
used to it.
yeah,
I'm a pedophile. I'm a demon. I'm a this. I'm a
yeah,
that. And many
yeah,
different groups all think I'm horrible. But if they actually listen to me or read my book, they're like, the guy seems to be okay. He seems to be a human rights person. He's an
yeah,
honest, trustworthy person. He's a forensic expert involved at
yeah.
Harvard Medical School. But in our final minutes, I want to come back to something really important for a lot of my listeners. Because, John, so many people have these early childhood experiences and they miss out on their education and they don't go back to school as you did. They don't pursue developing the mind and learning how to be an academic scholar. So if you can provide some words of encouragement and sharing more about what, I think I mean, and I said, I was on a plane yesterday and I was talking to a guy. He said, yeah, I'm thinking of doing my master's. I'm 50. And I'm like, well, I did my doctorate at 63. He's like, you
Yeah.
did? And I'm like, yeah. And I told him the story. I want to change the law. I got involved with this forensic think tank. And this professor said, you need a doctorate and you need to do a quantitative study to show your model
Hmm.
scientific. And if you
Hmm.
do it, I'll supervise your research. To which I said,
Hmm.
Michael Commons, I'm too old. I'm 63. He said, I'm 77. Do you want to
Never
change
too
the
late.
law or don't
Yeah.
you? So I did it and I got smarter
Yeah.
from doing this. It was a really wonderful experience. My memory got better, my concentration got better, my writing skills got better. And as much as I rebelled in my mind against the idea of getting a doctorate for decades, my self-identity changed.
Hmm.
When
Hmm.
people say, Dr. Hassan, welcome to this, Dr. Hassan, it feels good. And you're going to
Yeah.
be a
Well,
doctor soon too.
and and you earned it, Steve. Unfortunately, a lot of the religious folks we talk about claim to be doctors, but haven't actually gone to an institution where they've had to do a quantitative analysis. But
Uh,
they've been, um, given
Unaccredited, in other
an
words. Yeah.
unaccredited honorary doctorate at a Bible college. That
Yeah,
sadly
Moon and
nobody's
his
ever heard
wife
of.
have doctorates too, and
Yeah,
by
yeah.
donating to universities, they got an honorary doctorates. But talk a
But what I
little
would
bit
say,
more about your
yeah.
journey and encourage people. It ain't too late.
Absolutely. Yeah. I would say, and I've heard you say this, Steve, and I've it's spoken to my own experience deeply, which is why I'm resonating it again. Is there was a lot of shame that was associated with my involvement in the Lairden School, and it took many years for me to be able to one recognize that some of the physiological experiences that I was having of depression, of anxiety, that was at times debilitating. Much of it was wrapped into the shame that I had internalized
Yeah.
through my experience there. And so, if you feel like you're alone, I would say you're not. There are others like Dr. Hassan and myself, and countless people, both who are speaking publicly, but many more who you may never hear on a podcast, who have gone through some horrendous things in the name of religion. And um, reach out
Yeah.
to the individuals who can help. When it feels appropriate and comfortable, start sharing your story, even if it's just little bits of
Yep.
it, because airing that helps to minimize the shame. And I guess the last piece of encouragement I would offer to those who are listening is believe in your goodness and believe in what you can contribute to society to make it a better place. Oh.
Absolutely. So, just to summarize, Jonathon Sawyer, for those who weren't paying attention in the very first minutes, has doing his doctorate. He's a doctoral candidate. He's published a very important piece called Unhidden from Self on LGBTQ students and the conspiratorial demonology of the New Apostolic Reformation. And we need more people speaking out who have exited what I consider to be an authoritarian mind control cult that's trying to take over the country and the world, and trying to take away human rights from everyone that doesn't want to subscribe to that, including Protestant scholars like Matthew Taylor and Ben Onishi and so many others. So thank you, Jonathon Sawyer.
Thank you, Steve,
for being you. And so, how soon do you get your PhD? Is there a time?
I'm in the candidate phase, which means I'm moving into dissertation territory, and it looks like I'll be thinking about more deeply the experiences of LGBTQ students in schools influenced by the new Apostolic Reformation. So, knock on wood, come spring of 2026, you'll be able to call me Dr. Sawyer. So send good wishes.
Fantastic. Well, we're going to have you back on if I'm still doing the podcast, and I hope I am, because I have the opportunity to meet really cool people like yourself and share your stories and give you a little bigger platform for folks who are my listeners around the world. And with that, I will thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Appreciate being on.
Steve Hassan here. You know, it's been decades since my family rescued me from the Moonies. I've been at this for over 47 years. The need has never been greater. If you're able, please consider hitting the super thanks button below, and it'll help us to do better. Every penny will help us toward our goal of educating the planet about undue influence. Remember, it's your mind. Only you should control it.